When we imagine medieval weddings, our minds often conjure scenes from fairy tales and historical romances. Handsome knights pledging devotion to beautiful maidens, elaborate ceremonies in candlelit churches, feasts celebrating love conquering all. The medieval period has been thoroughly romanticized in modern culture, painted as an age of chivalry, where courtly love elevated women to pedestals and marriage was a sacred bond blessed by destiny. The reality was far grimmer. Medieval marriage was less about love and more about property transfer, political alliances, and social control. For most women, marriage meant losing what little autonomy they had, submitting to a husband's absolute authority, and facing the very real possibility of dying in childbirth before reaching 30. For men, marriage brought responsibilities and expectations that trapped them in rigid social roles, with little room for personal choice. And for both parties, the institution was governed by a bewildering combination of church law, secular custom, and family pressure that could make the simple act of getting married, or unmarried, a nightmare of legal and social complications. Let's examine what medieval marriage actually looked like, stripped of romantic gloss and Hollywood fantasy. The first and perhaps most fundamental difference between medieval and modern marriage is the question of choice. Today, we take for granted that adults choose their own marriage partners based on mutual attraction, compatibility, and love. In the Middle Ages, particularly among the nobility and wealthy merchant classes, this was rarely the case. Marriage was primarily an economic and political transaction between families. When two people married, they weren't just joining their own lives, they were merging properties, creating alliances, settling disputes, or consolidating power. The individuals getting married were often the least important factors in the decision. For noble families, marriage strategy was crucial to maintaining and expanding power. A daughter was a valuable asset who could be married off to secure an alliance with a powerful neighbour, end a feud, or gain access to disputed territory. Sons were positioned to marry heiresses who would bring substantial dowries and lands. Love was not merely unimportant, it was potentially dangerous, as romantic attachments might conflict with strategic necessities. The age at which these marriages were arranged could be shockingly young. Noble children might be betrothed in infancy or early childhood, their entire futures decided before they could walk or talk. These early betrothals served as contracts between families, binding them together for years or even decades before the marriage was actually consummated. A girl might grow up knowing exactly whom she would marry, never having any say in the matter, watching her predetermined husband from a distance and wondering what her life with him would be like. The famous case of Margaret Beaufort illustrates the extremes of this system. She was married at age 12 to Edmund Tudor and became pregnant almost immediately. She gave birth to the future King Henry VII when she was just 13 years old. The birth nearly killed her and left her unable to have more children. She had no choice in any of this. Her marriage and pregnancy were arranged by adults pursuing their own political ambitions with no regard for her well-being or wishes. Among the common people, the situation was somewhat better but still constrained. Peasants and townspeople generally married later, typically in their early to mid-20s, and had more say in choosing their partners. But even here, marriages required parental approval and were heavily influenced by economic considerations. A young man needed to establish himself economically before he could marry, acquiring land or mastering a trade. A young woman's family needed to provide a dowry, money, goods or land that she brought to the marriage. Poor families might struggle for years to accumulate adequate dowries for their daughters. Parents could and did veto unsuitable matches. If a young woman fell in love with someone her parents deemed inappropriate, too poor, from the wrong family, lacking in prospects, she would typically be forbidden from marrying him. Young men who pursued relationships against their parents' wishes risked disinheritance and social ostracism. The Church officially taught that marriage required the free consent of both parties, but consent was often coerced through family pressure, threats, or simple lack of alternatives. It legally completed the marriage contract and, crucially, established the wife's virginity, or lack thereof. Among noble families, witnesses were often present to verify that consummation had occurred. This might mean standing outside the bedroom door and listening, inspecting the sheets afterward for blood, or in some cases, actually being present in the room itself at a discreet distance. Imagine the psychological pressure on both parties, but especially on young brides. Many noble women were married in their early to mid-teens to men they barely knew, sometimes much older men. They had typically received minimal education about sex. Virtuous maidens were supposed to be innocent, and too much knowledge was considered dangerous. On their wedding night, they were expected to submit to a stranger's sexual advances, possibly with witnesses nearby, with little understanding of what was happening or why. For the groom, particularly if he was young, the pressure to perform with witnesses waiting must have been immense. Failure to consummate could lead to annulment, social humiliation, and questions about masculinity. Medical texts from the period discuss remedies for impotence on the wedding night, suggesting this was a recognized problem. The emphasis on virginity created its own traumas. A bride who failed to bleed on her wedding night might be accused of not being a virgin, bringing shame on her family and potentially invalidating the marriage. Some families tried to game the system. There are medieval accounts of mothers pricking their daughters with needles before the wedding night to ensure blood appeared. Other women suffered genuine injuries because their husbands, often inexperienced themselves and operating with poor anatomical knowledge, were rough or clumsy. After the wedding night came the expectation of regular sexual activity oriented toward procreation. The church taught that sex was primarily for making children, and couples who actively tried to prevent pregnancy were sinning. For women, this meant that marriage inaugurated a cycle of near constant pregnancy that would dominate their adult lives and quite possibly kill them. When a medieval woman married, she underwent what legal historians call civil death. She effectively ceased to exist as an independent legal person. Under the principle of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. She could not own property in her own name, make contracts, or bring lawsuits without his permission. Any property she brought to the marriage became his to control. This loss of legal personhood was absolute in ways difficult for modern people to comprehend. If a woman inherited land from her father, once she married, her husband controlled that land. He could sell it, mortgage it, or give it away without her consent. If she worked and earned money, that money belonged to him. If someone owed her a debt, her husband collected it. If she was injured and deserved compensation, her husband received it. The wife's body also belonged to her husband in legal terms. He had absolute right to sexual access. The concept of marital rape did not exist in medieval law. He could beat her to enforce discipline as long as he didn't kill or permanently maim her. The often cited rule of thumb that a man could beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb is likely a myth, but the underlying reality it represents is not. Domestic violence was endemic and largely accepted as a husband's prerogative to control his household. If a marriage turned violent or unbearable, a wife had almost no recourse. Divorce as we understand it didn't exist in medieval Catholic Europe. Marriage was a sacrament, indissoluble except in extraordinary circumstances. Annulment was theoretically possible if the marriage could be proven invalid, perhaps due to consanguinity, being too closely related, impotence, or coercion. But annulments were difficult, expensive, and available primarily to the wealthy who could navigate church bureaucracy. A woman couldn't simply leave an abusive marriage. If she fled, she had nowhere to go and no means of supporting herself. Her natal family might refuse to take her back, as a failed marriage brought shame, and they'd already spent her dowry. The church preached wifely submission and encouraged women to endure suffering as Christ had endured the cross. Society offered no shelters, no legal protections, no concept of women's rights within marriage. Some women did leave intolerable marriages, but they paid a heavy price. They became social outcasts, lost access to their children, who legally belonged to the father, and often fell into poverty and destitution. A few entered convents, but this required dowries and wasn't an option for poor women. Others survived on the margins of society, doing whatever work they could find, always vulnerable to accusations of immorality or witchcraft. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval marriage for women was the near certainty of multiple pregnancies and the very real possibility of death in childbirth. Modern maternal mortality rates in developed countries are approximately 17 deaths per 100,000 live births. In medieval Europe, Estimates suggest rates of 1,000 to 1,500 deaths per 100,000 births, roughly 1 to 1.5% per birth. That might not sound catastrophic until you consider that medieval women who survived to adulthood typically had 5 to 8 pregnancies, sometimes more. The cumulative risk was staggering. A woman who had 6 pregnancies faced roughly a 6 to 9% chance of dying in childbirth at some point, 1 in 11 to 1 in 16 women. And this assumes all pregnancies resulted in live births. Many women died from miscarriages, ectopic pregnancies, and other complications that modern medicine handles routinely. Medieval women understood these risks intimately. They saw their mothers, sisters, friends, and neighbours die in childbirth with grim regularity. When a woman went into labour, she might well be saying goodbye to her living children, making final arrangements, and preparing for death. The Church encouraged women to confess their sins and receive last rites before labour began, just in case. The actual experience of childbirth was harrowing. Labour occurred at home, attended by midwives and female relatives, but no doctors. Medicine was a male profession, and male physicians generally didn't attend births. Pain relief was minimal. Perhaps some herbal preparations, prayer, and gritting one's teeth through contractions that could last days. When complications arose, options were limited and often fatal. If the baby was positioned wrong, if labour stalled, if the pelvis was too narrow, if there was excessive bleeding, any of these could kill both mother and child. Midwives had some techniques for turning babies or assisting difficult births, but nothing like modern caesarean sections, which weren't survivable, before anaesthesia and antiseptics or forceps delivery. Sometimes the choice came down to saving the mother by killing the baby, or letting both die. Medieval medical ethics generally prioritized saving the mother, but either outcome was traumatic. Even women who survived childbirth faced serious complications. Infection was common and often fatal. Puerperal fever killed many new mothers in the days and weeks after delivery. Fistulas, tears between the vagina and bladder or rectum caused by prolonged labour, left some women incontinent and socially isolated. Prolapsed uteruses, severe tears and chronic pain affected many survivors. For men, watching their wives die in childbirth was also traumatic, though obviously different in nature. Many men lost multiple wives to childbirth and remarried repeatedly, creating blended families of children from different mothers. These serial marriages created complex household dynamics and inheritance issues. Children grew up with stepmothers who might favour their own biological children, while fathers struggled to balance competing family obligations. The Catholic Church's prohibition on divorce trapped countless people in miserable marriages. Once married, you were married for life, regardless of how bad the situation became. The only escape routes were annulment, extremely difficult, or death. The grounds for annulment were narrow and often difficult to prove. Marriages could be annulled if one party was already married to someone else, if the couple was too closely related by blood or previous marriage connections, if one party had been coerced into the marriage, or if the marriage had never been consummated due to impotence. But proving any of these things years into a marriage was challenging. Wealthy and powerful people could sometimes obtain annulments through influence and money. King Henry VIII famously broke with the entire Catholic Church when the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. But Henry was a king. Ordinary people had no such options. They were stuck. This created situations of profound misery. Couples who grew to hate each other, marriages where violence was constant, partnerships that produced no children, a major concern in an era when children were economic necessities, all persisted because there was no way out. Some couples separated informally, living apart while remaining legally married, but this created ambiguous situations and prevented either party from forming new legitimate relationships. The prohibition on remarriage after a spouse's death, for a decent mourning period at least, created additional complications. Widows and widowers needed to wait before remarrying, but economic pressures often pushed them to remarry quickly, especially if there were young children to care for. The Church might criticize such haste as showing insufficient grief, but survival often demanded it. Bigamy, marrying someone while already married to another person, occurred more often than official records suggest. In a world without centralized record-keeping or identification documents, people could sometimes move to new regions and claim to be unmarried. When discovered, bigamy brought severe penalties, including excommunication and public punishment. But the temptation existed for those desperate to escape intolerable marriages. Marriage in medieval society was fundamentally an economic institution, and the financial pressures surrounding it shaped lives in harsh ways. The dowry system meant that families needed to accumulate wealth to marry off daughters, and poor families sometimes couldn't afford it. A dowry typically consisted of money, goods, household items, and sometimes land that the bride brought to the marriage. The husband controlled this property during the marriage, but it was technically supposed to be preserved for the wife's support if she became widowed. In practice, husbands often spent or lost dowries, leaving widows impoverished. Families with multiple daughters faced crushing pressure. Each daughter needed a dowry, and daughters typically had to marry in age order, the eldest first, then the next, and so on. If the eldest daughter couldn't attract a suitable husband, younger sisters might be stuck waiting years for their chance, their youth passing while they remained in limbo. Poor families sometimes had to choose which daughters to provide dowries for, leaving others without prospects for marriage. These unmarried women had few options. They might become servants, live with relatives as permanent dependents, or if they were very lucky, enter convents, which also required dowries. Though for men, the pressure to establish economic independence before marriage meant long years of preparation. A craftsman needed to complete his apprenticeship and establish his own workshop. A peasant needed to inherit or lease land sufficient to support a family. This meant most men didn't marry until their mid to late 20s at earliest, creating a decade or more of sexual maturity before marriage was feasible. A recipe for frustration and pressure to frequent prostitutes or engage in other extramarital sexual activity. Widows faced particular economic vulnerabilities. A woman whose husband died might find herself suddenly impoverished if he had spent her dowry or left debts. She might lose access to his shop or land if it passed to his sons or other male relatives. If she was still young, pressure to remarry quickly might leave her little time to grieve or to carefully consider her options. Perhaps the most alien aspect of medieval marriage, from a modern perspective, is the attitude toward romantic love. We consider love essential to marriage. Indeed, we think marrying without love is somehow wrong. Medieval people, particularly among the upper classes, often viewed love as dangerous precisely because it might conflict with practical necessities. The literature of courtly love that flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries often depicted love as occurring outside of marriage, between knights and ladies who were married to others. This wasn't necessarily celebrating adultery, though sometimes it was, but rather exploring the tension between romantic passion and social duty. The very existence of this literature suggests that people felt the tension acutely. Some medieval thinkers argued that love could grow within marriage over time, as couples came to know and appreciate each other. This was seen as proper and healthy. But passionate love at first sight, overwhelming attraction that swept people away, this was viewed with suspicion as a kind of madness that led to poor decisions. Young people who insisted on marrying for love against their family's wishes were often portrayed in medieval stories as foolish, victims of their own uncontrolled passions. The proper approach was to marry sensibly, to the person your family chose, and to develop affection gradually within the bounds of duty and respect. This doesn't mean medieval people didn't experience passionate romantic love. They clearly did, as evidenced by love letters, poetry, and stories of elopements and scandals. But the official cultural attitude was that such passions should be controlled, channeled, and subordinated to social obligations. Medieval marriage, stripped of romantic fantasy, reveals itself as an institution that served families, communities, and social order, rather than individual happiness. It transferred property, created alliances, ensured reproduction, and maintained social hierarchies. The actual people getting married were often secondary considerations. Does this mean every medieval marriage was miserable? No. Humans are remarkably adaptable, and many couples doubtless found genuine companionship, affection, and even love within the constraints of their time. Arranged marriages could become loving partnerships. The shared experience of raising children, managing households, and facing life's challenges together could create deep bonds. But the system itself was stacked against individual fulfillment, particularly for women. The loss of legal identity, the constant danger of childbirth, the inability to escape bad marriages, the lack of choice in partners. These created an institution that modern people would find intolerable. When we're tempted to romanticize medieval marriage, or to imagine that traditional arrangements were somehow better than modern ones, we should remember what those traditions actually entailed. The freedom to choose our partners, to marry for love, to leave marriages that become abusive or unbearable, to control our own property and bodies. These are precious liberties that medieval people, especially women, couldn't even imagine. Medieval marriage teaches us that institutions that seem timeless and natural are actually historical constructs that change over time. What seemed normal and inevitable to medieval people strikes us as oppressive and unjust. What seems normal to us would likely strike them as chaotic and dangerous. Neither system is perfect, but recognizing the flaws of the past helps us appreciate the progress that has been made, and reminds us that further progress is both possible and necessary. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of history, make sure to subscribe. There are so many more untold stories waiting just beneath the surface.